Okay, so before we move on to the revolution, from the revolution, I want to include some information on different demographics of people that participated in the revolution in all sorts of different ways. So first, let's talk a little bit about African Americans and the revolution. The South had about 400,000 slaves, but the British saw them as a resource to exploit to, on the Southern whites because of the vulnerability and danger it provided. Many Southern blacks struck out for their own freedom by seeking liberty behind British troops. Before the war was over, the conflict actually provoked the largest slave rebellion in American history before the war. Plus, you have the fact that they were hearing their masters talk about liberty, and that made them question their own oppression. In the North, for example, slaves petitioned state legislatures for their freedom, while in the South, you had more resurrections or insurrections, excuse me. In 1765, for example, 100 South Carolina slaves, most of them young males, fled their plantations. This photo, or this image, I should say, is representing Peter Salem. And he was from Massachusetts, and he was freed by his master to serve in the militia against the British. And he fought at the Bunker Hill and did significant work there, along with 12 other freed blacks. And he went on to live a life of freedom. I believe he became a cane maker or a cane weaver or something like that. Um, in November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, who was Virginia's royal governor, so on behalf of the British, issued a proclamation offering freedom to all Virginia slaves and servants who were able and willing to bear arms, who would leave their masters and join the British at Norfolk. And within weeks, several hundred responded. No one knows exactly how many African Americans sought liberty with the British, but many think as many as 20% may have done so. And the irony is, while many colonials saw the British as a symbol of tyranny, they, however, saw them as a symbol of their freedom. Some of the blacks who did join the English troops received their freedom. At the war's end, thousands were evacuated. I don't know if evacuated is the right word, but they went with the British to Nova Scotia. However, the locals there were pretty hostile towards them. So by 1800, many of them left Canada to help establish a free black colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa. That's where that red dot is on the map. Many of the slaves who fled behind the British troops, however, never actually got their freedom. Under the terms of the peace treaty, hundreds were returned to their owners. Right? So think about that and let that sink in for a second. Several thousand others, because they were still seen as an economic resource, not really as humans, their value as field hands were too great to be ignored, and they were taken to even harsher slave conditions to work on the sugar plantations in the West Indies or the Caribbean. Some fled to the north afterwards, thinking that slavery was outlawed there, and there was much less slavery, but as we all know, it still did exist in the north. Okay. Now, let's switch gears a little bit and think about Native Americans in the war. Now, keep in mind, Native Americans is putting it in one big group, one big term, is a bit ineffective because there were different tribes, different nations, and they all responded differently and acted differently. By the time of the revolution, most of the coastal tribes, like ones that would be around here, were already gone because of white settlement pushing them out, disease, things like that. But there were still many powerful tribes between the Appalachian and the Mississippi River. The Iroquois Six Nations is an example of about 15,000 people, and they dominated many of the western tribes up to the Ohio Valley, where you have the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami. The southeast had the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee. So you still had all these troops there. When the war began, both sides urged neutrality with the Indians. However, military speaking, they knew that the Native Americans were too important to ignore. So by the spring of 76, both were seeking alliances with them. The natives sort of considered this the white man's conflict or a family affair between almost like parents and their children. So the natives decided their options. Many of them decided to side with the British for various reasons. Um, but things didn't go well for them mostly. The Iroquois saw it as a family affair, wasn't getting involved. But by 76, colonial troops raided into Mohawk territory west of Albany. So then the British persuaded the Iroquois to join them against the rebels. Most of them did so by the summer of 77. But it was a fateful decision. Over the next few years, the Iroquois and English devastated large areas in central New York and Pennsylvania. They destroyed property, and the Americans came back with revenge. During the summer of 79, American troops launched a series of punishing raids into the Iroquois country. They burned villages, they killed men, women, and children, they destroyed their corn. They had a motto: civilization or death to all American savages. And by the end, the Iroquois lost about a third of their people, along with many towns as well. Keep in mind the reasons why many of them did side with the British. The British, before then, were providing them with various forms of trade, um, but also they promised them against colonial expansion. Remember, there wasn't really much settlement past the Appalachian when they were the 13 colonies. The British sort of kept the colonials to the east of the Appalachia. So the natives were fearful that if the British left, the white settlers would move west into their territory. And we all know that they did. All right, so that's what we were talking about a little bit as well. Okay, so one more thing I want to talk about before we move on is the idea of women and citizenship. Women did, of course, get involved with the war. They followed troops from battle to battle, along with children, many times, um, and did all sorts of work for the military. Not really so much as soldiers at this point, but were still an important factor. But think about the idea of liberty and the revolution and the things we read about in, let's say, the Declaration. And to the fact that women weren't voting contradict some of those ideas. Here, where we live in New Jersey in 1776, if a woman met all the other voting requirements, property and residence requirements, she could vote. And in the 1780s, many women took advantage of that. But of course, some men were not happy about it and they complained. And by 1807, New Jersey took back women's right to vote. And we all know that that right didn't become a federal right until less than 100 years ago. So, of course, some people saw this as an opportunity for women to show their patriotic connections, to show why they should be able to vote. There are essays written by women like Marcy Otis Warren, Esther DeBert Reed, saying how women needed to contribute to the patriot cause. Sometimes it was just by not wasting money on clothing and hairstyles to use for the cause. Sometimes it was things more serious. Think about how women's roles now became more patriotic. If you were a woman and you were sewing or spinning yarn, you were now helping to be able to boycott British goods because you wouldn't purchase from them. So even domestic roles became more patriotic. And that's something what we're going to talk a lot about again, even when we cover World War One. Keep in mind, some women did see that if we're going to fight for rights, you need to include women as well. I have the picture here of Abigail Adams. We all know that she was the wife of President John Adams eventually. And she protested the contradiction of men's subordination to women while they extolled the principles of liberty and equality. She wrote to her husband, "I cannot say that I think you are very generous to the ladies. For whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over all wives." So it was not something that women were not trying to think about. It took a long time, but you see that the seeds are already there. All right, we'll talk about this more next class, and I'll see you then.